Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom, live and online, and welcome to Wednesday afternoon lunch and learn. I want to wish each and every one of you Gamar Chatima Tova. I hope that you had a very pleasant, meaningful, deep Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is not a holiday we wish you a pleasant holiday on, but it should be a meaningful holiday, a holiday that brings truth to bear and allows you to reflect a little on your life and who you are and where you've gone in your life and what are the things that we need to do to continue forward. So welcome. I'm delighted that you're here. You've made it through the holiday, and I'm delighted that we made it through the holiday, which wasn't easy. We'll be having some time to talk about that in the weeks to come because it was a unique and interesting holiday for those of us who put services together for the community. We are back at Lunch and Learn. We're studying again. Of course, this coming week, we're going to begin the holiday of Sukkot. This year, we're very fortunate that the October holidays are all on weekends. So Rosh Hashanah was on a Saturday, Sunday, Yom Kippur on Monday. This Friday night, Saturday and Sunday, we welcome the holiday of Sukkot. Sukkot, in a nutshell, is everything that Yom Kippur is not. On Yom Kippur, we fast. On Sukkot, we feast. On Yom Kippur, we separate ourselves from our bodies. On Sukkot, it is all about the body. It is about smelling things that are delicious and beautiful, about experiencing the sensual joys of the world, and about feeling God's bounty in the world. And those of us who are fortunate to live in Southern California, where the weather is nice this time of year, it's an especial mitzvah to go outside and have a meal outside under the chuppah, under the sukkah, under the spreading canopy of the sukkah. And at least if you don't even have a sukkah, just go outside and do it underneath the stars. The nights have been beautiful here. And you'll have a special sense of who and what we are in the world. And that's what Sukkot is here to bring us. Then there's some deeper parts of Sukkot, which we'll have occasion to talk about at Torah study and other times, about the reflections on what it means to be a creature in nature and the difference between our moral sensibility, our moral being, and our natural being. And that's one of the things that the holiday of Sukkot raises for us. But for now, go outside, build a sukkah, cook a meal, invite some friends, social distance, wear your mask, but enjoy the deep joy of being a human being at this time of year. So Shana Tova to everybody. Our study has taken us through some of the important chapters of the book of Psalms. Book of Psalms, as we've talked about, is the first great book of the Hebrew section, the section of the Hebrew Bible called Ketuvim. There are 150 Psalms, and they range from Psalms of adoration, thanks, prayers of thanksgiving, prayers of gratitude, to words of complaint before God, to words of reflection on what it means to be a human being. And that's the psalm I'd like to do today. Psalm number 8 is a psalm which reflects on the paradoxes of God's existence and ours, the paradox of God and the paradox of human beings. Now, paradox is an interesting concept to begin with. Paradox means two things that are contradictory, but they're both true. Now, how can that be? In the world of mathematics, it can't be. In the logic of mathematics, at least as explained to me when I was a kid, you have proposition A and proposition not A. One of the two of them is true, and one of the two of them is false. A or not A can't both be true. But when it comes to the life of the spirit, it's always the case that A and not A are both true. Because the life of the spirit is trying to capture something which is beyond the simple logic of mathematics. I'll take a silly example. Do I want my children to be independent, to grow up and go out into the world and fend for themselves? Or do I want them to be closely related to us, to family, and to be connected to us? Well, the answer is yes, I want both. Am I part of a people that is concerned about its own existence in the world, concerned about its own defense in the world, or am I part of a people who is concerned with the whole world and those outside of our boundaries? And again, the answer is yes. Whenever we think about truths of the spirit, truths of the person, they're always contradictory. They're always contradictory. I am connected to my kids, and at the same time, I do wish them to become independent. I'm part of a people that's concerned for its own existence and also concerned for the welfare of all humanity. You can't get away from these contradictions. This is the great truth of the spiritual life. They're always what we call dialectical. It's a fancy word meaning two truths that go along with each other. There's a very famous joke about this, of course, right? Two litigants come in front of the Rebbe and they're complaining about a certain problem. And one of them steps forward and he gives the answer. He gives his case in front of the Rebbe. He pleads his case with passion and brings evidence to bear. And the Rebbe listens to him and says, well, you're right. And the other fellow steps up and says, just not so fast, Rabbi. Listen to my side. And this guy pleads his case with passion and presents evidence. And the Rebbe says, you're right. And then the Rebbitzin, the rabbi's wife, busts into the room and says, Rabbi, how can it be that he's right and he's right? And the rabbi says, you're right too. But the idea that you can have multiple truths that might seem on the surface to be contradictory, but that we live out in our lives. We all live out these lives of connection and independence, of concern for the other and concern for ourselves. Great spiritual truths always come in paradox. And so today we have a psalm that's going to highlight two special paradoxes, the paradox of God and the paradox of human beings. And that's what we're going to look at today. So let's take the text. Let me put it up on the screen. Wait just 1 second. Got to fix something, and we'll put this up on the screen so that everybody can see it. There we go. Psalm number 8, the 8th chapter of the book of Psalms, begins with the title. Remember, the titles were added to the Psalms later. So Laminatseach means for the conductor. That means that's the conductor's note. Al Hagitit. Now, no one knows what exactly that means. It probably is a musical notation for the conductor to know what he's supposed to do in order to sing the psalm. Mizmor LeDavid. It's one of David's psalms, or at least the psalm in the tradition, in the style of David. And it begins and it ends with a sort of crescendo. So you think about a symphony that begins with a crescendo, right? Adonai, Adonenu. Now, Adonai, Yud He Vav He, that's God's proper name. We pronounce it Adonai, but ancient people would have pronounced whatever that name is. We're not allowed to pronounce it. No one knows really how to pronounce it. Adonai, Adonenu. Adonenu is the more common now, say, my Lord. So Lord really is how it's typically translated, because we translate this name. It's God's name, Adonai, who is our Lord. Ma'adir Shimcha v'chol haaretz, who is majestic. How majestic. Now the word ma, we're going to see this a number of places in the psalm. The word ma can mean what. The word ma can also mean and how, right? It's an exclamation. So ma'adir. How great is your name, bechol haaretz, in all the land, in all the world, asher tanau dech al hashamayim, and you who have covered the heavens with your splendor. So look at the parallelism. Remember, we talked about how things are parallel. You say one thing, you say the same thing in different words. Adonai, Adonenu, our Lord, ma'adir shimcha bechol haaretz, how great is your name in all the land, right? And now, Asher Tanau Decha Ala Shamayim, you have covered the heavens with your splendor. Land, heavens. The word Hod, right here, this word Hod, right here, Hey Vav Dalet, Hod means light, glorious, splendiferous light. So you imagine that the psalmist is outside on an evening, maybe a Sukkot evening even, and he's looking up at the stars. And how many human beings in the course of our long history as a species have looked up at the stars and wondered. The stars make us all filled with something. There's a feeling you get. Remember the first time you ever slept outside under the stars as a kid, maybe in summer camp? And there's this amazing feeling of being very, very small in a huge universe of light and wondering, what does it mean? And you feel the earth beneath your back, and you feel like you're riding through this huge universe on this tiny planet. And that's what our psalmist is feeling now. He looks up at the stars and he says, there's no one greater on the earth, and look at the light of the stars that all reflect God's greatness. Now, here's the interesting thing. Our pagan ancestors, pre-Judaic pagan ancestors, looked up at the stars and they thought that the stars were themselves deities. We maintain this, by the way, because we have the names of the planets are all names of the Greek deities, Saturn, Jupiter, Pluto. These are all Neptune. These are all names of the Greek deities, gods. The ancients thought of the forces of nature as themselves personified gods. So thunder and lightning are gods, and wind and heat and sun are gods, and the stars are each gods. That's where you get astrology from, the idea that somehow they cast the power upon the earth. Here we have a different idea. Here the idea is that I don't worship the stars, I worship the creator who is behind the stars. I see the stars as the product of a creator. I mean, the idea is that behind the physical phenomenon is the real power that has created all these things. That is what the psalmist is saying. That's what Israelite religion added to human consciousness. We don't see physical phenomenon, we don't see natural phenomenon as themselves deified or sacralized, sacred. We see a God who stands behind them. And in seeing through them to a God who stands behind them, we're able to understand that the whole world is one, that the world isn't a set of forces fighting against each other, that there's a harmony to the creation of the whole world. Now, the next line is controversial because the next line doesn't make any sense. That's why, right? Mipi olalim oinakim, from the mouth of infants and sucklings. Right? You have founded strength on account of your foes to put an end to enemy and stranger and avenger. Right? So the problem is that there's two ideas here and they don't go together. Mipi olalim v'yonakim, that's from the mouth of babes. That's the phrase from the mouth of babes, right? And then you have this other idea starting with this word, right? Yasadata oz litman sorecha. You have founded, you have rooted your strength, right? Against your enemies, lashbit oyevu menachem, and to push back, to lashbit from the word Shabbat, meaning to give rest or to subdue your enemies and take your vengeance against them. So the question is, what is the mouth of babes things doing here in this line about warfare? And the best suggestion comes from Professor Sarna, who was my wife's Bible teacher at Brandeis University, which is that this line actually belongs up here. That really the line should be, "O Lord, Lord, how majestic is your name through the earth, you who have covered the heavens with splendor from the mouth of infants and sucklings." In other words, that even babies know how great God is. And then the new line starts here, that they put the verse marker in the wrong place. The verse marker should have gone right there. And that this new line, because God has founded strength against his foes and put an end to enemy and avengers. Now, let's stop here, take another idea. Who are these enemies? Who is God at war with here? There were ancient myths that the Israelite community inherited, that creation was not the calm, sweetly organized process that we read in Genesis chapter 1. And we have remnants of those myths. We know these myths because we have the documents that record these myths from ancient Canaanite civilizations. We have those documents. We found them in archaeology, but we have remnants of them even in the Bible itself. Even in the Bible itself. And the ancient myth was that God had to go to war against the forces of chaos. And the forces of chaos were named. They were named Yam, which is our word for sea, but this was a sea monster. Tehom, which was the deep, the female monster of the earth, this female source of the earth. Leviathan, Rahab. These were names of mythological creatures. They show up in the book of Job. They show up elsewhere in the book of Psalms. And there were these ancient myths that before the world was created, or as the world was being created, God went to war with these monsters and pushed them back. So when we read on the second, we read in the beginning of Genesis, right, that Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, that the Spirit of God floated above the water. The water was the monster. The water was the chaos. And in fact, you have later the second day of creation, God is pushing back the water so that dry land emerges. Well, that process is so easy easily described in Genesis chapter 1 on the second day of creation. But in fact, the ancient myth had it that was a great war. There was a great battle of God against the sea monsters, a God against the sea itself. The sea didn't want to let go of its dominion over the world. And the sea, of course, is a representation of chaos. The chaos of the world, the schmutz of the world, didn't want to let go. And God had to fight it back in order to create an ordered cosmos, in order to create what we call nature. And you can see where that myth comes from. That myth, of course, comes from that terrifying sense that we live just on the other edge of chaos, that there's so much chaos left in the world. And those of us who are, looking outside the window and thinking about COVID outside, it's not hard for us to imagine this, that just on the other side of God's creation is a world of chaos. So here we have this God who is glorious on earth, glorious in the heaven, taking revenge against these enemies that he has vanquished in order to create the world that we share. And now the psalmist looks in that world and expresses appreciation. Ki iresh shemecha, right? When I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you set in your place, right? So I give glory to God when I look up at the sky and I see what an ordered universe there is, and I think about the chaos that had to be set back. Now, there's a paradox here, and here's the paradox. The paradox is that it's the same paradox you'll find elsewhere, by the way, in Jewish prayer, that, well, we glorify this God who is universal, this God who is so powerful, just enormous power. That's also a personal God. Look at the word you. He's referring to you. God is you all along. He never changes to a third person. God is you, right? You. So there's a deep personal relationship with this God. So the paradox here, is that the same God that is so enormously powerful and fighting back chaos all the time to give us a cosmic world that we can live in, an ordered world, a controlled world, a predictable world that we can live in. That's the same God that answers our prayers, the same God that hears us cry, the same God that comforts us when we are in pain, the same God that we ask for healing when we need help. That paradox between this enormously powerful God of the cosmos and this deeply heartfelt personal experience of God, that's paradox number one in our psalm. Now we move to paradox number two, which is human beings. If God is a mystery, we are equally a mystery. We are equally a mystery. And you'll recognize these words because these are the words that we use to open, these are the same words that we use to open Yizkor prayers, okay? Ma anosh ki tizkerenu ben adam ki tifkedenu. This is a parallelism, simple parallelism. Enosh and Ben Adam mean the same thing. They're the common words for human being, right? Man or human being. What is a human being that you, God, take notice of us, right? And the human being that you are mindful of us. I mean, you, God, who are in charge of all of this, and yet you know me, you have some relationship with me, you care about me, right? And this is a beautiful line, right? You have made him just a little bit less than Elohim, than the divine. Elohim could either mean God himself. In other words, the human being is just a little bit less than God. Or Elohim here could also mean angels. It's used elsewhere in the book of Psalms to mean angels. So we human beings, if you think about a scale of being, right? You have rocks, then you have animals. Animals are divided up into different layers of animals. And then you got human beings, and then you have angels who are heavenly messengers and heavenly creatures, and you have God. So we're sort of in the middle. And the great paradox of the human being, of course, is that our nature is being in the middle. Anybody who's in the middle is pulled on both ends. We have an animal side, right? I can eat an enormous amount of chocolate chip ice cream if you put it in front of me, and an animal side. And we have an angelic side. And the Bible has a notion that there's no such thing as quote unquote human nature. that really we are given the choice at each moment to either go toward the animal within us or to go toward the angelic or the divine within us. Right? We are a composite creature. We are a creature of open destiny and of open nature. And the question is, what are you going to do next? Where are you going to go next? You're going to go upward toward your upward is the metaphor, of course, but you're going to move toward the angelic within you, or you're going to move toward the animal within you. And this is the great question. So he first says, it's a wonder to me, says the psalmist, that God even knows I exist. That this God who is so powerful and responsible for the fate of the whole universe cares about me, understands me, knows me. But then he says, but the reason is because I'm just a little bit less than him, a little bit less than God, as it were. That unlike the animals or unlike the rocks or the trees, there's something divine within me. There's something divine within me, but I have this composite nature. And this is the paradox of being a human being. And what is the upshot of this? What is the implication of this, right? Right? You have made him master over your handiwork, right? Tumshilehu b'maaseyadecha. Now, the word mashal, this word tumshilehu is a strange word grammatically, right? But mashal means to rule over, to have dominion over, to be in charge of, to have authority over. You made us human beings responsible for. You gave us authority over all of the works of your hands, right? Kol shatar tachat raglav. You made everything, all of the world beneath his feet. The image of beneath his feet is a very Middle Eastern image. A king sits on a throne, and he sits on the throne, and he has a footrest, and he puts his feet on the footrest. Anyone who is represented as under his feet is under his authority. It's under his power, is under his responsibility, is also under his protection. So you have lots of references across the Bible where somebody is vanquished and they are taken under our feet. You've put your enemies under our feet. What's happening is, because we are just a little bit less than God, we've been given responsibility and authority over the whole world, and the whole world's been put under our feet. We're in charge. Sheep and oxen and all of them, wild beasts too, the birds of the heaven, the fish of the sea, whatever travels the path of the sea, everything that is alive has been given to us human beings. And here the notion isn't that we can exploit them. The notion really is a sense of responsibility. We share the responsibility of the Creator to protect and to nurture the world and to promulgate the world of life. That's what's been given us. That's our responsibility. So here is the paradox of being human being. Compared to God, we are very small. We are very small, but God put us in a very remarkable position by giving us responsibility for all of the creatures of the world. We gain this powerful responsibility. You have the same sense, by the way. Those of us who have been parents have this very interesting sense, right? Because you have this kid, right? This child, you hold the baby in your arms, and then the child grows into a toddler, and then the child grows into a little kid, and then from the kid into a teenager, God help us, and then from a teenager into a young adult, and you look at the kid and you say, you look at the kid and you say, I have authority over you, as it were, but I want the best for you. I want you to grow into your own selfhood. And you ask yourself, how was it that I came to create this child? I mean, it was a process beyond my imagination. I mean, I know all the biology of it. I actually took that class in junior high school and paid attention, but that's not what it is. I mean, to be responsible for having created a human being and nurtured a human being and raised a human being. And then you see, so it's a combination of complete power and complete powerlessness. It's the mystery of my smallness and the wonderment of my greatness at the same time. Human beings are both small and great at the same time. We are puny, tiny creatures living fragile lives in the world on the one hand, and we are powerful, given this responsibility by the Creator himself to guard the world and protect the world and nurture the world, and given all the powers and able to do that. And I think that this combination of respecting our abilities and being humble about it at the same time is what the psalmist is trying to get at. And then we finish, he goes right back to the very beginning where he started. Adonai Adonenu, Madir Shimcha b'chol haaretz. It's the same line that we started with. So once I have surveyed these two paradoxes, the paradox of God's greatness and yet God's attentiveness to me, and the paradox of my smallness, my puniness, and yet my responsibilities in the world, my authority in the world, my position in the world, having seen both of those, he returns to the idea of how great the Creator is, who created a world of these paradoxes. All right, everybody take a breath. That was a lot of talking. Let's see if there's any questions, comments, or counter sermons. Yes, Bert, let's unmute you.
I'm assuming the responsibility we have been given not only includes the name, the animals, etc., but the rest of the planet, as stewards of the planet, the climate, etc. It doesn't say that explicitly, but my sense would be if we got the whole thing, we got the whole thing.
Yeah, I think you have that exactly right. It doesn't say that explicitly, but it doesn't need to. It's poetry. This is poetry, and poetry is going to suggest the truth, not spell it out. But I think what you suggest is something very nice. You put this in the chat because I want to credit you with the word. There's a beautiful word, the word steward. A steward is a person who is responsible for something, and the responsibility is to serve it, to take care of it. And the notion of leadership, stewardship, leadership is a big idea in the Christian community. And it's something that I think that the Jewish community can learn from as well, because it's implicit in the Psalm. You're responsible for this, and your dignity comes from that. There's a dignity in being responsible. Look, there's a dignity in being a father or a mother. I have to tell my young friends that never be embarrassed by what your kid does. Your kid's going to scream in a movie theater. Don't be embarrassed. Your kid's gonna make a fuss in an airplane. Don't be embarrassed, right? Because we want to shh, But the idea there should be a dignity in being a parent, and at the same time, there's a tremendous humbling effect in being a parent. You're serving something outside of yourself that is incredibly demanding, but you're serving something bigger than yourself, something glorious. So here, I think the idea is exactly that. When God creates man, and God puts him into the garden in the second chapter of Genesis, God says to him, I want you to name all the animals. Naming something is part of its creation. That's what God names stuff. We name all the animals. We are the ones responsible for protecting, nurturing, and promulgating life on the planet. I mean, the beginning of the second chapter of Genesis says there was no life on the planet because there was nobody here. You need people to have life on the planet. We are responsible for life on the planet. Now, that's a huge responsibility. That's a huge responsibility. And it's really only in our generation that we've come to take this with some seriousness, because it's only in our generation that we have a global worldview. There were great people in every generation who had a global worldview, right? The prophets who wrote Genesis 1 had a global worldview, right? Isaiah had a global worldview. Other great prophets and teachers of other faiths and traditions had a global worldview. But it wasn't until very recently that we, as a populace, sort of gained a global worldview. And that's one of the things I think that this media, that media, social media, computers, CNN has given. I remember the first time I watched this CNN World Weather Report. I was sitting in a hotel in Europe, and the only thing on the TV that I could understand in English was CNN. Right? And I'm watching the weather report, and they're giving me the weather in Johannesburg and Rio de Janeiro and Omaha, Nebraska, and Beijing, China, and Kiev in the Ukraine, and Paris, France. And you realize, my God, we're one world. It's just one world. And we all share the same weather, and we all share the same dreams, and we all share the same problems. And how do you move from a tribal sense of being of vision to a global sense of vision? And this psalm is a global psalm. It says we are responsible for it all. That's where God has put us. And the interesting thing is we're a little bit less than God. That's what he says. You made him a little bit less. You made us a little bit less than God. So the question is, can we manage a natural universe without God's wisdom? How much of God's wisdom can we acquire in order to manage this living universe? And that's a really interesting question. Bert, go ahead, please.
When you mentioned the responsibility for naming in the second chapter, there are a number of indigenous people who believe until a person has a name, their soul, or their entity, their essence is not complete. So by giving us the responsibility for naming, it would seem to me that that's really powerful if you believe the indigenous legends, in that we are completing, whether it's completing the soul of an ox or a person or a tree or a pear. It's an act that's very fulfilling and completing.
Well, I've got news for you. It's not just indigenous peoples, although I have great respect for their mythologies. We have the same thing. We have the same thing. There is a deep, deep Jewish mythology around naming. Why is it that Ashkenazic families name kids for people that are dead? Because we want to keep alive the qualities of that person, which are somehow embedded in the name itself. So you name the kid for the grandfather, the great grandfather, the grandmother, the great grandmother. You keep alive the qualities of that human being. When somebody dies, we promise to keep the name alive. We say that's one of the reasons you say Kaddish, is to keep the name alive, right? You say the name in shul. Okay. The worst insult in the Bible, the worst insult in Judaism is Yimach Shmo. May his name be blotted out. Because if you blot out a person's name, that's the last vestige of them in the world. You blot out every vestige of them left in existence. The most famous example of that curse, Yimach Shemo, my bubby used to use it all the time. Whenever she'd mention Hitler, she'd say, Hitler, Yimach Shemo, and then she'd spit, Pfueh, right? I don't recommend that, but that's what she would do. The most famous example, however, is Haman. Haman is an example. Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites. In the book of Exodus, we are commanded to wipe out the memory and the name of the Amalekites. So every time Haman's name is mentioned in Shul, when we read the Megillah, what do? Yeah, we blot out the name because the name carries a piece of it. Now, the fact that we were given responsibility to name stuff means that we have a certain responsibility over the essence of the world about us. And that's very important. That's a very important statement of who and what we are in the world. Stanley.
Yes.
Hi.
The speaking of names, the most example in our tradition is Yad Vashem. That's how much we value in remembering names. The other thing I wanted to mention, we talked about chaos and creating a world out of chaos or around chaos. The next thing from chaos, between chaos and order, is randomness. And that's something in our lives that happens all the time that we have to deal with.
Right.
And in particular, was this, something that's out of order, or something, like we're saying with a paradox, or just random. So throw that out. And of course, Mordecai Kaplan had random as the, if it's not random, that's what creation is, that's what God is.
Right. So randomness is an element of the world. One way to understand it in the Genesis myth is that this is the part of the world that wasn't created, that God didn't get to, that left to us to take care of. The other way to think about it is that randomness gives us a bit of freedom. Otherwise, otherwise we are, everything is sort of programmed in advance. You ever met, when I was a kid, I read those Isaac Asimov novels where, it's some day in the future, in 1,000 years in the future, they build a computer which can comprehend every factor in the world and predict the future. Right. And then what happens is, of course, there's still randomness left in the universe, and they can't predict everything. and that randomness, I think, is important. I mean, randomness is what gives us interesting human beings, right? If otherwise, if there was no randomness, sperms and eggs would gather, and the kid would be a perfect combination of mom and dad. Remember, there was a very famous case. Isadora Duncan was the most famous dancer in Europe at the beginning of the century. And she wrote a letter once to George Bernard Shaw, who was the greatest intellectual, the greatest writer in the world. And she said, Dr. Shaw, let's get together and make a child. The child will have my exquisite dance, my exquisite body, and your exquisite mind. The child will be a super kid. And George Bernard Shaw wrote her back and said, yeah, but with our luck, it would end up with my body and your mind. That's randomness, right? That's the randomness. By the way, Stanley, you said something really lovely. The idea that we remember names, and that Yad Vashem, for example, is trying to remember the names of those. I see this at the synagogue. It's one of the most touching things. We have these memorial plaques at the synagogue. A few bucks you pay to the synagogue, and they put up a bronze plaque with the name of your loved one who has passed away. And I've seen this many, many times where people, they know where their loved one's name is on the wall. You got to go find it. And they'll go and they'll just put their hand on it and they'll just touch it. And, there's something really powerful about this, right? This is the vestige of my loved one left in the world, besides me, is a name that I want to preserve. And I want to hold it for just a moment. I want to, by holding the name, by putting my hand on the plaque, which just has the letters of the name there, I somehow reconnect with the person that I love. It's a very deep and powerful impulse. And it's a very lovely way to say that naming is a very powerful thing. And that's part of the paradox of being human beings. We may be small and subject to randomness and fragile, but we have these powers in the world that God has given us. That's the interesting paradox of the Psalm. Let's finish. Any other last questions, comments, counter sermons before we conclude? Then let me wish everyone really a very, very sweet year. Shana Tova, a very, very good year. It's wonderful to see all of you, and all of you watching on Facebook. It's certainly wonderful to connect with you as well, and wish you a very, very pleasant and wonderful new year. Sukkot begins Friday. Friday night, of course, we'll have Minyan at 5 o'clock. Torah study, Shabbos, like always. Sunday, we have second day of Yontif. And then every day during the week, you'll get an email from VBS, but every day during the week, we're going to have something. I'm doing storytelling. Rabbi Farkas is doing a food night with Chef Danny Corson, and Rabbi Hoffman's going to be doing a family game night, and we're going to be doing some teaching of Torah. And every night during the week, a chance to connect with our community and be together, even if we can't be together in person, to be together and to see each other and to share a little bit of joy together of the holiday. Otherwise, I really want to recommend this more than any other year. Get outside. Get outside under a sukkah, get outside under the stars, have a meal. You can't get too close to people, but get close enough to be able to give them a l'chaim, a wish of a new year that's sweet. And everyone enjoys Sukkot. Shana Tova, take good care. We'll see you next week. Next Wednesday, 12:30, another Psalm.
Rabbi, have you heard of God is in the crowd?
No. God is in. Yes?
Look it up.
I will.
Okay, God is in the crowd.
If it's Wednesday, it's Psalms. We'll see you next time.